Now, I want to talk over a few characters because I want to talk in categories. So the first thing, because people seem to have a problem with race bending across the board, right? And I think there's a few different categories of race bending, in the superhero genre. I'm not going to talk about other genres, where, I think it's completely appropriate. Somewhere I think it's sometimes appropriate, and sometimes somewhere I think, it's kind of more mixed. So I'm going to break it down as superheroes, villains, and supporting characters. And I'm going to talk about the uncanny, for some reason, need of Hollywood to, I don't know what they have against ginger people, ginger white people, but like blacks are straight up snatching their roles, like mixed race and black people are straight up snatching ginger people's roles. I don't know why ginger is so offensive to so many Hollywood people, but every time you have a ginger character, you can be guaranteed that they will be race bent. And I'm going to go into that and see what the weirdness is in that. But first of all, let's talk about supporting characters. Now, supporting characters to me, I've looked at James Gordon. James Gordon has recently been obviously race bended, and now he's black in the latest Batman movie. He's being played by a phenomenal actor, Jeffrey Wright, who's absolutely incredible. And, quite frankly, it would be, I think, fantastic in the role and would give us a very new detective noir style of Gordon that we haven't quite seen before in the Batman films. Now, the reason I bring up James Gordon is because there's a whole group of characters in superhero mythology called the supporting characters. You've got characters like Jimmy Olsen. You've got characters like Lois Lane. You've got characters like Steve Trevor for Wonder Woman. There's a number of different characters that are around the main character. Now, these I bring up because I don't think anybody should ever have any problem with them being race bent. Now, we have to take a slight detour back into the history of when comics were actually invented, obviously. So the first comic, I believe, was, Superman, and I think it was 1938 that he came out. Now, in this time, when you're looking at race bending and you're saying, well, there's 10,000 DC Comics characters, and why do you have to change, like these characters? Why don't you use Bumblebee or use, somebody else as a character, who's already black? Why change the main characters like James Gordon, who's always been white? And they have this fan base, and this fan base, likes comic accuracy. And it's like, to me, I think that is one, not looking at this in a historical context, right? So, for instance, let's look at James Gordon. His first appearance was in Detective Comics, May 1939, okay? Now, in that time, I think you would find it rare to find any black person or Asian person in comic books that wasn't, in fact, some kind of horrible caricature of that race, like whether it be blacks or whether it be Asians. So it took a very, very long time before I think even comic creators were comfortable with making black characters. And obviously, if you have, it's just like in life, it's like each of these characters have a certain currency in terms of what they will do for a black actor or an Asian actor's career as a franchise. If you're going to gamble on it, sometimes, new characters, you just have a gamble like Jason Bourne and boom, It's a massive franchise already, straight off the bat. But other characters are more tricky, with females and colors of actors of color. When you're thinking about taking on a franchise, whether it be a comic book or an IP that's already existing or anything like that, you probably, if you want your career to take off, you probably want to take on a character that has some history, that has some recognizability. I mean, even look at characters who do have history and they still fail and they have brilliant movies, like Dredd. Dredd is a perfect example of a movie that was excellent, absolutely excellent, with an IP that I would say is quite a strong IP. Dredd was certainly more known than, I don't know, Iron Man before he came out, and it absolutely did nothing in the box office. It staggered in the box office. So the point I'm trying to make is, when you have characters with a great deal of history, whose stories kind of write themselves, they have so many stories you can draw on and all of this kind of thing, they become much more attractive for young actors to take on. And to say that these kind of roles, where you have the big, the Supermans, the Batmans, the Wonder Womans, the Thors, the Iron Mans, these big characters, and all of their supporting casts are white in the comics, all of their villains are white in the comics, right? That no Black or Asian person can take over any of the roles in those movies. I mean, come on. This is basically, it's putting a barrier to the success of actors of color. These are the main IPs, the biggest shows in town, the films that everybody goes to and flocks to these days, whether it be Star Wars, whether it be something like the comic book movies, all of these kind of things, these massive IPs that have historically existed for a long time. If you said every character that started off one race has to remain that race, you're talking about a racist policy, essentially. I'm not saying that a character like James Bond should be race bent, because I don't think that makes sense, or changed into a woman. James Bond as a woman doesn't make sense, right? But when it's Jason Bourne, if you wanted to do a reboot of Jason Bourne without Matt Damon, why not have a black? There's nothing about that character that says he has to be white. And in fact, in the case of Jason Bourne, certainly if you make him a black actor, you can add more dimensions to Jason Bourne that weren't even explored in the previous movies. So you can actually make it more interesting. But going back to the point of supporting characters are the most fluid of all the categories, superheroes and villains, where it really doesn't matter a lot of the time their race. There's very, very few supporting characters in comics, because usually they don't have an origin of their own. Their origin depends on the superhero's origin. So you can be telling one Batman story where James Gordon has a different kind of history, depending on the Batman story you're telling here, and then another where James Gordon has a completely different other history as well. Depending on the iteration of Batman, depends on the iteration you're going to get of James Gordon. And that goes the same for Perry White. That goes the same for Lois Lane. Lois Lane doesn't really have a tethered to the ground history where you have to say Lois Lane is necessarily a white woman. Lois Lane could be an Asian woman, no problem. I mean, you could say, well, do Asians really have the surname Lane a lot? Well, yeah, sometimes they do have English surnames, so absolutely. So again, my point is this. I'm not saying you should be able to change any superhero, because I'm going to go into superheroes in a second and why they present a different problem. But certainly with supporting characters, you can't say these supporting characters that, you know, they started off white. It was 1939. We're living in racist times when black people were still fighting for the vote, when Asians were still migrating over to America and being treated like second-class citizens and war enemies, and beaten up and whatever on the streets, when Jews were still living in ghettos, when, you know, when all of these things were happening, right? Of course, when there were, you know, I think you know, in the 50s, you got to a point where there was the McCarthy trials, where they were putting creators and famous people on trial for being communist sympathizers. If they had have been making black and Asian and gay you know, superheroes and characters in their comics, you best believe those McCarthy and FBI investigators would have been looking at them. It would have taken a huge amount of moxie and balls for some of these creators back in the day to really have presented anything except for white Caucasian characters. And since it is, you know, ethnic minorities as well as a big group of white people who have supported these characters for so many years, why won't you allow them to play in the sandbox if it's harmless, like James Gordon? That is absolutely harmless in being black. It's absolutely harmless Perry White being black. It's absolutely harmless Lois Lane being Asian. It's absolutely harmless. I like Jimmy Olsen as Ginger. I don't know why, but Jimmy Olsen bothers me a little bit more. But even Jimmy Olsen, he doesn't have a history of his own. It could be made interesting if he's Asian or Indian or black or whatever. An Indian James, an Indian. Bloody hell, Jimmy Olsen could be interesting. Now, here's another one where I think there's a supporting character that is a little bit problematic, which is Wonder Woman's Steve Trevor. Now, Steve Trevor has been depicted black in the comics before, but one of the things I was going to say is, for me, a standard for whether you should be able to race swap or not is, does it change anything about the if you make them black, does anything, or Asian, does anything change about the character that fundamentally goes against the spirit of the character? And then secondly, can you actually improve the story a little bit by, or show a different side of the story by making them a different race? Now, you could say that probably about like a lot of characters, about can you show a different side? But I mean, I'll give you an example in Magneto a bit later of what I mean by, when you change the race, it can actually show a different dimension to the same story. But with certain characters, as I said, if you change their race, does it change the story that you're telling about that particular superhero? Now, one of the ones I think about when it comes down to this is Steve Trevor, in the Wonder Woman lore, right? She's Steve Trevor, the handy boyfriend, the secret, the army spy and pilot, he's existed in World War II, he's existed in the 80s, he's existed in modern times, modern iterations of him. Now, here's the thing, like the dynamic between Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor is that Steve Trevor actually is a representation in some way of man's world and its corruption, and why the Amazons have run away from man's world. Right? Because men are corrupt. So in some way, Steve Trevor has to be a little bit of a punching bag for Diana at first to say, hey, men are are this, and men are violent, and men are, you know, and you conquer and you take over wars. And I remember one beautiful moment in the Wonder Woman movie, which I couldn't believe made it into the movie, was when the Native American character says to Diana, you know, that all of his people are gone. And then she asks, who killed all your people? And he said, his people, pointing to Steve Trevor. And it's very, very poignant. And it's moments like that in Diana's journey that Steve Trevor presents to her as a man who is a good person, but at the same time appears to be everything that her mother and her society has told her is the image of the devil, of the, you know, of men. They're bad, they're horrible. Now, does that change if the character is a person of color? Well, I think it does substantially change that particular relationship. Does it make it more interesting? Because now Steve Trevor, if you say black or Asian, can be seen as part of an oppressed class. So he can clap back at Diana and say, wait a second, don't tell me about being oppressed. You guys got to run away and live on your little paradise for thousands of years. I've been in the thick of it, being, you know, my ancestors enslaved, killed, you know, going through a civil rights movement, going through this. Don't you dare tell me that I'm a man and I'm part of the power structure, you know, problem in the world. So I think that dynamic actually fundamentally changes with Steve Trevor. And therefore, in some ways, I would say that you can only do a black Steve Trevor where it's an Elseworld and you're willing to address those issues, where Wonder Woman confronts him and says, look, men are this and men are bad and men are whatever, and they're violent and they're horrible and they cause wars. And he says, wait a second, man, you can't say that to me. You don't know what I've been through. Right? That is an interesting dynamic that I think could be explored in an Elseworld or a film that, you know, like comes along after you've established what Steve Trevor is supposed to be, and then go on to a later film where you kind of explore a different dynamic with Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor. So that's my thing on supporting characters. I think for the most part, it really doesn't matter when you race bend to, you know, supporting characters. But there are those rare few that obviously it does make a difference to the character dynamics if you change the race. Now, I want to go on to superheroes. Now, superheroes, I would say, very rarely is there a superhero where their race is actually really, really tied into their origin and it can't be decoupled. So, for instance, you know, Green Lantern Hal Jordan, does he have to be white? No, not really. I know there is John Stewart, obviously, but again, he doesn't necessarily have to be white, even Hal Jordan. There's nothing tied to that character that necessitates that he have to be a white person. But they've already got John Stewart and they've got plenty of Green Lanterns that are black and Muslim and all of that kind of stuff nowadays anyway. So that's good. You know, Shazam, Billy Batson, does he really have to be a little white kid? Not really. In fact, in some ways, like him being an orphan, being thrown around the foster system, could actually be more interesting if he was a little black kid. I mean, with his new Rainbow Coalition family that has been the new thing in Shazam comics, where he's got like one black sister and an Asian brother, and they all become the Shazam family, you kind of feel like it would be unnecessary to change Billy into a black kid now, because, you know, he's got all of his family now who kind of represent all the colors of the rainbow. But again, it doesn't necessitate, there's nothing in Shazam's DNA that says like that character has to be a white kid, right? He turns into Shazam, Captain Marvel. you know, you can go through and through and through with a number of different characters, including Supergirl, who I'll go on to after a segue into Superman, because Superman presents a very, very different issue. Now, Superman's the most complicated person to talk about race bending with. There's so many like good points by the other side where you go, well, he's an alien, so does he have to be, you know, those who are pro race bending Superman? You know, he can be any race. Who says the Kryptonians are white? Why are they even white people? It's already strange that that this far off planet has evolved and they look exactly like white people. Why is that in the first place? But like, since they have, why can't they have black people? Like, you know, Earth does. So why can't Superman be black? Now, I'd say this is where this standard comes in of, are we fundamentally changing the character, the roots of the character and the iconography of the character for us to be able to realistically change Superman or Clark Kent into a white person? Now, let's make clear, probably the reason Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster made Superman white, you know, kind of all American looking, rather than a Jewish kid from the Jewish ghetto, you know, where his ship turns up to some Jewish parents in the Jewish ghetto, is probably because they realized, like, you know, Jews wouldn't sell at that time. There was still a lot of anti-Semitism in 1939. People didn't want to go in America, didn't want to enter the fray of a new world war. And they felt like the Jews were, you know, basically in the country were lobbying for America to save the Jews in Germany, which they rightly should have been doing. And America just didn't want to be part of that. They'd already joined in World War I, didn't want to go back into World War II. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism around at that time. So Superman being a classical white guy probably has a lot to do with that. That being said, his story is iconic. Now, can you make a Superman, for instance, that lands in the ghetto in America, like somewhere in the ghetto, or lands somewhere in Africa, and he's black? Sure, I think that's a good way. He can land in some farmers in Africa, and that's a great Elseworld story, right? But what's the problem with making Superman black, but keeping it the exact same story? So he lands in Smallville. There's this kindly couple, Ma and Pa Kent, who take care of him, teach him the greatest values of humanity, etc., etc. Why would it be problematic with him being white? Well, I did a little bit of research, a census into the Kansas population. And where is my Kansas population? Well, okay. For some reason I can't find it right now. I don't know why. Anyway, so the Kansas population of farmers is about 50-something thousand farmers in Kansas. You can double check this, but there's about 50,000 farmers or so in Kansas working right now with active farms. I'm sure, you know, with everything that's been happening in the world recently and globalization and stuff like that, that the farming industry is much less than it was in Kansas amongst local small-time farmers. But there's about 50,000 remaining. Of those 50,000 farmers, only 210 from the last count were black. There were very few Asians, if any. And, you know, it just there was literally like about 200 and something that were black. So let's look at this statistically. We have a family in space sending their kid to a farm sending their kid to America, and he just so happens to. There's ones where they actually target the Kents, which I think is pretty stupid. I don't know, like how they would know that the Kents, exist. I don't even think it's sensible that they should know that. They should just know Earth is an inhabitable planet. I hate when they start talking about they know that human beings exist on the planet. They should just send him to a habitable planet and hope for the best. But usually they know at least that human beings exist on on Earth, right? And they've watched it for a while. But they send Clark purposefully, sometimes purposefully, to the actual Kents themselves. But sometimes most of the time, they just send him, to Earth and hope for the best, knowing that human beings exist on this world and knowing that he's going to be strengthened by the sun. Now, statistically speaking, here's the thing about Superman, right? So he sent from these parents billions of, millions of light years away, or hundreds of thousands of light years away, to Earth, right? And he just happens to land in Kansas, right? And this family of Jonathan and Martha Kent are well known in the community. And suddenly a baby turns up. And this baby, they have to somehow explain, like they fostered from their aunt, or a sister of theirs, or something like that. They have to explain this fucking baby. Now, if this baby is black, they have a lot more explaining to do. Let's be realistic about it, right? Where did they get this black baby from? Did they just decide to adopt and they didn't tell anybody about it? And it's just like quick as that. Like, you one day you apply, the next day you've got a little black kid. It's like there's a lot more explaining to be done than their classical answer, which is they can just say it's a family member's kid who passed away and they're looking after the kid now, right? So it becomes a much more organic story if the baby they find is also a white baby, right? You don't have to start explaining things to interrupt the story where Jonathan Kent and Martha Kent are explaining why they have this black child. A black child is going to stick out much, much more to that community than a white child. I'm not saying that a black child, if they had been talking about adopting a kid or anything like that with their neighbors, and then suddenly they have a black kid, then yeah, sure, then there's going to be no problem. No one in Kansas, I think, is going to start giving them grief about it. But if they just, one day they don't have a kid, next day they have a kid, that's weird already, right? And then you're going to have to explain the black thing. So that changes fundamentally the story. And that's what I mean. And it changes it in a way that it's it doesn't add anything, and it just makes for added extra complication. Now, you could say, well, what if you just make Jonathan and Martha Kent black? That's kind of weird even. I mean, maybe other people won't think of this, but I'll just be thinking in the audience, what is the likelihood in Kansas, of all places, of a black baby being sent millions of miles in space to Earth, lands in one of the whitest neighborhoods in the world, and ends up in one of the only black families in that neighborhood? That's pretty bizarre, like a coincidence. So that will take me out of the movie a bit. It won't completely remove me from the movie, but again, it's another hassle and quirk that is unnecessary in the Superman story. I think there's other aspects of Superman as well that make it that, I think it's better him being white. It's more powerful as a character, as a representation of this particular type of character, that he is amongst, a privileged class of people or at least in terms of racially, they are the race who has, I suppose, the most power in the world, right? And yet he is somebody who cares about everyone no matter what. I think there's something actually a little bit powerful about that in and of itself, which is worth preserving in Superman, that he has no reason to identify with the little guy. You know, no inbuilt reason. Like if he's black and he's going through racism in Kansas and he's going through all of these hard times in Kansas, then there kind of becomes a reason other than the Kents raised him well and their values and their view that all humanity has dignity, that leads him to treat everyone with dignity and save every last kid. And you know, he doesn't care if the kid's black or white or Asian or whatever. He'll fly in and do everything he possibly can to save them and help them, and you know, all of those kind of things. He has to be somebody who has no other reason other than how Jonathan and Martha Kent raised him to view that, not that he's actually felt oppression and whatever himself, and now he's like, oh, well, since I felt it, I'm going to now go out and save people. That's the thing I think about Superman. And I even think that a little bit about Captain America as well. Because Captain America, there's no reason for him to be white other than that scene, you know, where, you know, in Endgame, where he's talking to the gay guy, right? And he's supposed to represent everything American, everything fair and just and best in American. And he's able to speak with a gay man about his lost love and see him as somebody worthy and whatever. There's a slight power in that. But beyond that, I think with Superman, you know, the essence of the character, there is some certain aspects of him that just make him fundamentally white. I think, you know, in terms of the logistics of him, of maintaining the origin of him landing in Kansas, being met by this Kansas family, and et cetera, et cetera. That being said, if you want to do an Elseworld where Superman lands in the ghetto and he's black, and how that would change Superman, how that would change Clark Kent if he lived and experienced those things, I think that's a wonderful idea. I think it's wonderful to do Superman stories where he lands in Russia, where he lands in other historical periods. I think that those are great stories to tell about Superman. And that's the power and universality of the character. But I think you have to get the central character right, especially in movies. You have to get that character fundamentally right for you to explore all these different other territories of what you can do with Superman by making Asian Superman and Black Superman and Superman who landed in Soviet Russia or Superman who landed in Nazi Germany. You have to get the ideal first before that has the impact. So last things last, we're going to talk about villains. Now, villains fall into, for me, into the same category as supporting characters. Villains often don't have origin stories outside of the hero that that they go up against. So Brainiac, for instance, in the Superman lore, has various different origin stories. He has origin stories that where he is from Krypton. He has origin stories where he's from Cthulhu. He has various different origin stories, and it really depends on the Superman story you're telling, what Brainiac you're actually going to get, you know. So it's the same with Lex Luthor. Sometimes Lex Luthor knows him from Smallville. Sometimes Lex Luthor is just the business guy who existed in he's always a businessman. He's always super intelligent. He's always very scientific. But apart from that, it's up in the air. Did he get his money from his family? Did he make his money on his own? You know, all of those things are up in the air about Lex Luthor, depending on the Superman story that you're actually telling. So that being said, villains are very much in the same position. You know, Catwoman, Poison Ivy, even the Joker. The Joker doesn't have to be white. There's nothing saying he has to be white. Nothing in essential to that character. He's a clown that likes to cause chaos, that laughs at you lot, and he's a sadistic psychopath or whatever, right? A black person can play that, an Asian person can play that. He doesn't even sometimes he doesn't even have a name or history. You know, he's a complete mystery where he comes from. So of course, Joker can be black or Asian or anything. And there should be no problem with race bending him. It's about coming up with rules for race bending where it makes sense and where it doesn't. And I think that's the important thing, a message that I want to send in this video. And with supervillains and supporting characters, really, it's up in the air. There's no thing that you can say stops you from saying this character is fundamentally somebody of color when they're a villain, like the Penguin. Penguin doesn't have a history necessarily. Sometimes he comes from a rich aristocratic family. Sometimes he's just a gangster who's made it, living on the streets and made it to the top. That can be a black guy. Kingpin can be a black guy. Ares, God of War, can be any character that is in, most villains in superhero mythos. Riddler, same thing. Most villains in superhero mythos are completely beholden to the origin stories or the stories that the comic book character is that they're telling of the comic book character at that time. Right? So you have a different Joker in The Dark Knight Returns. You have a different Joker in, Brian Azzarello's Joker. You have a different Joker in the Joker movie. There's so many different variations, and that's the same with all villains. People think that that's only the Joker, but that's the same with basically all comic book villains. Same with, the Riddler. Riddler doesn't have any particular origin story. So anyway, there are some, wrinkles in this, so for instance, I would say I would much more buy a black or Asian Magneto than I would, a Professor X. Why do I say that? Well, Professor X is actually, he could be black. I really do think so. The more I think about Professor X, the more I think the only thing tying him racially to being white would be something that would be a racist assumption on my part, which is he comes from a wealthy family. Now, a black person can come from a wealthy family. I don't think generations long wealthy family, but at least that he could have come from a well-to-do family from Africa, something like that, like a privileged family from Africa who traveled to the States, and he's well educated and whatever. And the same with from an Asian family with that kind of thing. It's different with someone like Batman, where he's stuck in Gotham, right? And you have to have a generation of family that's made their money for generations long in Gotham City itself. And then you're like, really, if you're talking about this is a family that's been maybe rich since the 19th century or something like that, really generations and generations of the Wayne family have been rich. Don't think it's going to be a black guy. Don't think it's going to be an Asian guy in Gotham City, right? So that's different. Whereas Charles Xavier, there's a little bit more wriggle room there. But certainly with Magneto, I think here's an example. And the reason I use him is where you've actually got a very, very good reason to give an opportunity to somebody else rather than a white Caucasian actor to play this role. Why do I say that? I say that because Magneto is, and please do subscribe if you're enjoying this discussion. The reason I say that is Magneto is tied to the Holocaust. He's a Holocaust survivor, right? But it's not essential that he has to be a Holocaust survivor. What he has to do in Magneto lore is to come from a situation where his view of humanity is fundamentally changed to a much more dark and cynical one, where if you don't take, if the powerful rule and destroy those who are weaker than them. So he has to believe that. So he has to believe, therefore, if mutants are superior and human beings are struggling and fighting against them, the only way to overcome them is to destroy them. The Holocaust isn't the only situation in human history that could have given him the perception of a perception of the world like that. The civil rights movement might have given him a perception of the world like that. And you could have another interesting dynamic between Charles and Magneto in that sense, right? Or it could have been, the genocide in that happened in Freetown in Africa. Where am I thinking of? In Rwanda, in Africa, in the 90s. Or it could be some conflict that happened in Asia, or a conflict that happened, between Pakistan and India, right? It could be any of those things that gives Magneto that world view, and you give an opportunity for another actor to bring another dimension to Magneto that we haven't seen before. Now, I want to finish with something a little bit lighthearted, because that's my opinion. I think superheroes, race bending in general. Oh, I wanted to talk about very, very briefly about Hawkman, because Hawkman's a really interesting one, because he's much like Magneto. Is like you actually get a chance to tell a different side of Magneto by changing the race, and it can be interesting, and it can update it, and it can get you out of that situation where you're like, well, the Holocaust is a long time ago now, guys. If you want Magneto to be anything less than 90 years old, maybe we need to update what conflict changed his mind, right? To have this kind of worldview. So with Hawkman, you have a similar thing. He started off white, but all of his roots are from, the character. This was the Hawkman. And this is one where you think, well, would the creator of Hawkman actually have changed it in 1940 if he had the ability to and didn't wasn't worried about like what people would think if he had a black or an Egyptian looking actor, an Egyptian looking character as a superhero. But his roots, this Hawkman, was Carter Hall, and he's a reincarnation of an ancient Egyptian prince, Khufu. Right? Sounds very ethnic to me already, right? And he becomes an archaeologist and goes to a museum and does all of this kind of stuff. Now, I don't mind him being white, but why not give like an Egyptian actor or a Middle Eastern actor, or maybe a black actor, but more Middle Eastern or something like that, a chance to be a superhero? Here's a great chance where you can race bend, and it completely makes sense to the mythology. He's from ancient Egypt. It actually it tightens up the mythology of something that couldn't have been changed in the time period that it did. So that's the last thing I wanted to say about that. And